Learning never ends at McMaster. Welcome to an opportunity to engage your curiosity from the comfort of your own environment. This online series is sponsored by the McMaster Alumni Association as part of our goal to connect with our global alumni and their curious minds.
Hello and welcome. My name is Hendrik Poinar and I'm a professor in the Department of Anthropology, Biochemistry at McMaster and a member of the Michael G. DeGroot Institute for Infectious Disease Research, where I study the genetics of past pandemics. Thanks for joining us on another For the Curious Mind webinar. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions at the end of this presentation, so just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen and I'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Today, I'm going to talk to you about how we can view the current pandemic through the lens of past pandemics. There are parallels and notable differences between the past pandemics and the current one we're all living through, with particular reference to the Black Death. So let's start. In 1346, an unknown miasma spread across the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, eventually consuming Europe in about 5 years. It didn't discriminate, old and young, sick and healthy, humans and animals. In most cases, it killed within 24 to 48 hours, but for some, death came quickly in as little as 7 hours. And importantly, no one really understood where it came from and why. It was labeled, or what we call now, as a shock disease. That is, it came out of nowhere, sort of like a winged death. So here's a version of that, often illustrated during the 19th century epidemics of cholera. Winged death approaching the city at night. You know, think of Camus' Plague and how often night plays a role in the metaphor of fear and disease. And yet, despite this sort of invisibility of disease, or infectious diseases leave traces in human bodies. So plague, it's important to remember that plagues, and Black Death was no different, transform people on a number of different levels. On a biological level, their physiological responses, scars, immune system that may be changed, or death even, and on an emotional or psychological level through the experience of suffering and for caring for people who suffer. But back in 1348, descriptions that are now made famous, like Boccaccio's Decameron, and immortalized as symptoms of the plague are shown here. You know, where a of blood from the nose was the plain sign of inevitable death. It began both in men and women with certain swellings in the groin or under the armpit. They grew to the size of a small apple or an egg, more or less, and more vulgarly called tumors. Soon after this, symptoms changed and black or purple spots appeared on the arms or thighs or any other part of the body. And of course, the bubo, here shown in this illustration, was the inevitable sign of death. Interestingly, you know, medieval people, despite what we consider to be tremendous ignorance in 1348, knew full well that something was amiss, something was wrong. But to them, these evil stupors were coming from above. And this was the angels of death that were causing death all around them. Without, you know, proper understanding of cause, the only true explanation, punishment, was our sins. And so in this situation, death would lose its arrows of pestilence against the sinners. And in this illustration here shown on the right, the sins of gambling and lechery are being punished, which were prime targets for the plague. And it was only the intercessions of saints and other sacred individuals believed to provide protection of the plague who would offer any chance of survival. One of the most famous, of course, is Saint Roch, here drawn by, illustrated by Tiepolo in 1730, along with his trusty Candide, was one of the few saints whose protection was invoked against the plague. And you can see illustrations and sculptures of Saint Roch throughout churches in Europe. Many claimed to have seen ominous portents that presaged plagues, such as earthquakes, weather, fire, and of course war. So war was the 100 Years' War between the British and English, was something that was ongoing during the Black Death. So there was an ever-changing landscape, and it was noted prior to these massive epidemics that arrived. And if you were in a city where plague had struck, Probably the most common sight during this time were the biers with the multiple corpses, as shown here on the left, so carrying the victims of plague through the cities. And new burial pits were being opened daily. So the one on the right now, the famous East Smithfield plague pit, was being built by the King's Degree in 1348 from a farmer's field, and it was used to cope with the mounting plague victims that were coming in daily. So here what you can actually see on the right is an archeological excavation that reveals the horrors of that epidemic. Bodies were thrown into newly dug trenches, and as Anne Carmichael described in her, in one of her many publications, dirt was sprinkled between the layers of limbs and torsos like lasagna. And then the ground was hastily sanctified and ready for the next layer of people that came. A common expected response was fear. When no one has a recourse, no one understands where the agent itself is coming from or causing disease, one defaults to fear. And it's important to remember that it wouldn't be another 550 years after the Black Death had ravaged Europe that Alexander Yersin, the Swiss microbiologist, would identify the causative agent of plague as this particular bacillus, Yersinia pestis. So here's just a cartoon illustration of a giant plague bacterium blown up to immense size. And of course, that description is really of Yersinia pestis was only able to be drawn by standing on the shoulders of giants of germ theory. So this is Robert Koch, of course, in 1843, and Louis Pasteur, both who were involved in both the discovery of important bacteria involved in infectious disease. So Koch discovered the Vibrio bacterium is responsible for cholera. And of course, Louis Pasteur, who showed the existence of microorganisms and the utility of germ theory. But of course, I'm getting ahead of myself. In 1346, the plague was a new disease. And the Black Death was the beginning of what is now known as the second pandemic of plague. And it spread from what was assumed to be at that time Crimea, someplace in the east, via trade ships through ports and across the lands in successive waves from Constantinople to the ports of Sicily and Messina, up through Barcelona, eventually to Marseille, across the landscape to Bordeaux, and then eventually up into London. And it crossed this landscape in successive waves, eventually consuming Europe in about 5 years. And in the end, Black Death would end up killing somewhere between 30 and 50 million people. And importantly, that's a mortality rate estimated at 30 to 50% of the Eurasian population at the time, which is really an unimaginable number. And the Black Death is just the starting point. So in this illustration here, you can see Black Death is highlighted in red at the far left corner of this graph. And it's only the beginning of 500 years of the second pandemic's long burn, okay? So repeated outbreaks that occurred almost every decade would consume millions and millions of people repeatedly until some call it its disappearance from Europe in the mid-19th century. Of course, the Black Death is bookended by two other plague epidemics. The first pandemic, or what we call to or refer to as the Plague of Justinian, which brought an end to the reign of Emperor Justinian and the Holy Roman Empire, and was actually remembered by some as the Great Mortality some 700 years later, was an epidemic that also consumed about 30 to 40 million people. And again, a huge proportion of the actual population living in Europe and the Middle East at that time. And of course, the other end is the third pandemic, the pandemic of plague, which we're living in today. Not surprisingly, in the absence or vacuum of an identifiable agent or something that we can blame, intolerance and racism raise their ugly heads. During the Black Death, it was Jews and prostitutes who were often blamed for poisoning of the wells or have simply aroused God's anger. And it was really called upon by religious flagellants who would then be told to take to the streets in the hopes of absorbing the sins of people. Since there was no explanation as to where these miasmas, these foul odors and airs were coming from, it was believed all was from above. And the plague is importantly really the image of death and dread. The artwork, which is immortalized in churches and monasteries across Europe, has come to represent the experience of plague. So here on the left, you can see death walking away with children. Children had high levels of mortality during the Black Death. And of course, the famous La Danse Macabre on the right-hand side, representing plague, repeated plague epidemics throughout Europe. And so, although throughout its history, Black Death has been cited as a human contagion that is being spread from human to human, plague isn't a disease of humans. Importantly, it's a disease of rodents. And it's important to remember that most infections, 60% of infections, actually stem from accidental spillovers from animals, what is known as zoonotic infections. So rather than think of epidemics as a singular cause, it's better to think of them as Professor Riss has put them. They're the result of a complex interplay of biological and social factors, which at certain points in our history create favorable ecological niches for given diseases to thrive and therefore disrupt humankind. So here you can see that really we need to think about epidemics in a very complex interwoven system of the ecology and the climate, the microbes, of course, and the humans, the biology, and of course, human behavior plays a huge role. And that's where our lab comes into play. We're very interested in the reemergence or emergence of pathogens in deep time. How and why do these pathogenic strains arise? When and where have they emerged? What were the anthropogenic or environmental influences that may have increased their arrival or their origins? Can we map their transmission in deep time? Were they more infectious in the past? And can we actually look or track changes in virulence? So our lab really looks carefully at the DNA of excavated skeletal remains from mass burials linked to pandemics. So here are 6 individuals buried in East Smithfield Black Death Pit in London. And these are meticulously curated at the Museum of London by our collaborator, Dr. Rebecca Redfern. And you can see this is a beautifully preserved skull from 1348 from East Smithfield. And we isolate DNA from the teeth, from the pulp cavity, because the pulp cavity buried within the enamel turns out to be a fantastic way to store over deep time small, tiny amounts of DNA of not only the host, so the human themselves who've passed away, but any septicemic organism, any microbe that might have killed the individual that's still clinging to the mineralized component of the inside of the tooth. And so we work in sort of CSI-like outfits in clean rooms. These are my fantastic grad students, Catherine and Jen, who isolate the DNA from these teeth and look for the pathogens. And it's important to remember that in the kind of work we do, those pathogen DNA molecules represent just a minute fraction of the total DNA burden that we find within these teeth. And so one needs to preferentially pull out the pathogen DNA, which sounds like an impossible task. And it was for many years until we came up with a novel technique aided by many other groups around the globe. And this is, I'm just going to try to explain this as best I can in as simple a method as I possibly can. So let's go back to that cartoon illustration of Yersinia pestis and let's open the hood. And if we look underneath, we'll find basically the genomic constituents of Yersinia pestis. So you can see a long black squiggly line there. That's a chromosome of about 5 million bases, A's, C's, G's, and T's. And you see 3 circular colored, what are called plasmids. And these are also important genomic constituents of plague. And I don't really have time to go into exactly what they all do, but the way that we can capture the DNA from these ancient teeth using modern genetic plague data is to actually take all that DNA that you see there now and cut it up into the little tiny pieces and put it onto these microscope slides. And then what we do is we take the DNA of a tooth and we flush it across those microscope slides. So here on the left side of the slide, you can see the slide with the red pieces of squiggly line of the DNA from the modern bacteria, and the little green pieces on that, I don't know if you can see that, but those are the pieces of plague bacteria coming from the ancient teeth. And so what we can do is we can throw out all the rest of the DNA that doesn't stick to those slides, and then we can preferentially just sequence or identify and read the actual code, ACGT, of the particular pathogen that's of interest to us. And so I'm skipping through years of work and lots of careful bioinformatics and molecular biology to show you that we've actually gotten really good over time at piecing together these ancient genomes, not just of Black Death, but of the Plague of Justinian, of ancient smallpox epidemics, and so on and so forth. So here's just an illustration of the Plague of Justinian. And what I'm showing you here are two reconstructions of the chromosome and these circular plasmids of the ancient plague, the Plague of Justinian. And now the question is really, some of you may be asking, well, that's all great and fine, but what does it really say or suggest about the history of plagues? Well, so this is a cartoon representing what we label as the relationships between human and rodent strains of plague, okay? So all strains here on the bottom of this figure that are colored in green derive from rodents. These are mice and rats and other forms of rodents that are known to host plague, okay? All the colored ones, the non-green ones at the top, the blues, the pinks, the reds, the purples, those are all strains of plague that come from humans, okay? So the question is, where do these ancient plague genomes actually fall? Well, so here's the interesting story. The reconstructed genome of Justinian sits embedded within those rodent strains at the bottom. And importantly, this suggests something about infectious diseases that we do see, which is that they emerge, they can wipe a large percentage of the population down, but then they often go extinct. So in the case of Justinian, we see no descendants of the strains of Justinian still circulating in wild rodents or people today. But that's a really, really, really different story than the Black Death. So here, the Black Death, which I've highlighted, sits at the base of all those non-green colored strains on this map. And so what that suggests is that the Black Death pandemic is responsible for seeding the world with its particular strain of Yersinia pestis. And so it's the ancestor of nearly all human outbreaks still occurring today. Now think about that. So an epidemic in 1346 is responsible for the epidemics of plague, which are still in Madagascar, India, and the southwestern United States. And how did plague make it from Europe in 1346 to the west coast of California? Well, by ships. So after the repeated emergences of Black Death, which spread back into China and eventually made their way to Hong Kong, an epidemic in Hong Kong and Indochina, the same epidemic that you're seeing managed to first identify the bacterium, they made their way onto ships all the way to the coast of California by 1902. It's the illustration on the bottom left-hand part of the slide, and eventually made their way into wild rodents such as squirrels and chipmunks from northern BC, Canada, all the way to Mexico. Okay, so what can the study of past pandemics like the Black Death teach us about new or re-emerging plagues like COVID-2, okay? The first thing to remember is that much of what we know and feel about epidemics today is anchored in epidemics of the past, in fact, the deep past. And we should consider both the similarities as well as the significant differences. Okay, so let's talk about some of the similarities. First, as such, plagues have come to occupy powerful mythic spaces in cultural history, and in turn, they've become metaphors for other unforeseen and frightening calamities of human existence. We used to think of them incorrectly as phenomena of the distant past, but clearly that's not true as we all sit here in self-isolation and quarantine, right? And one of the first things that's universal to all plague responses is fear. This is a response immortalized in art at the time and through time. And I'm going to have to apologize to Edward Munch here. This Oreo cookie on the right-hand side is not quite the image that will resonate for years after COVID subsides. But ask yourself, why did this quarantined individual decide to etch this image into his vanilla filling? Fear is a natural evolutionary response to the unknown, to infection. And since much of it is anchored in our inability to know what precisely causes the infection, it makes sense that this forms part of our response today. By the late 14th and 15th century, the Italians knew full well plague and its potential contagiousness. So suspected ships with sick individuals were quarantined, that is marooned for 40, 40, the Italian word for 40 days on lazarettos, these small islands in the Venetian lagoons, before people were allowed to come ashore. In fact, cholera, here represented again as winged death, both on the left, slips into the city by water and at night, resulted in repeated quarantines over and over and over again, both in European cities as well as in cities across the United States as well. So how does that look compared to today? Well, surprisingly similar to how we respond today. The key with quarantine is to move quickly. No benefit comes from acting slowly. So we know that a response to COVID was both extraordinary. Massive quarantines took place in China, but at the cost of coming too late in January, not December when it should have been. And governments are always admitting there was a problem in the first, always admitting there was a problem in the first place comes often too late. In fact, it's important to remind ourselves that the presence of plague is a tacit admission that something is wrong with the system. It's an embarrassment to states for whom epidemics are seen as failures. So you can expect denial when sanctions against admitting the presence of plague are huge. So let's think about the Spanish flu in 1918. Look what happened. Spain was the only free press that was allowed to report on people dying from influenza. Other Western presses, such as those in the US and the UK, were not only not allowed to report on, in fact, the press were fined or jailed if they did so for fear that it would damage the morale of the war effort. Another important thing to really consider is that inevitably plagues always come from somewhere else. Here in his famous painting by Jean Gros, which was commissioned for Napoleon's coronation, Napoleon is seen visiting the defeated Ottoman soldiers. So here are the images drawn in the Oriental style. You can see sort of the arches and the typical sort of Muslim colors, emphasizing the difference here between the Middle Eastern soldiers who are all infected. You can see they're not only they're naked, but they're dying in the foregrounds on the sides of this illustration. And the French, who are, of course, exceptional and healthy. Right? This imbalance really emphasizes the misperception that some are better or more blameworthy than others for infectious disease. Right? And so this really emphasizes this notion of what was known during the plague times as European exceptionalism. Right? Everybody in Europe was fine. We understood health well. We weren't dirty or filthy, whereas those outside, those from the East, those from the Orient, weren't seen that way. But here's what's so interesting about this painting that I really love. If you look really carefully at Napoleon's doctor, here's standing right behind Napoleon. So Napoleon takes his glove off and is touching the buboes of an infective Ottoman soldier, right? But look at his doctor behind him who's got a mask on, shall we say. He's holding his handkerchief up to his nose because his doctor knows full well this is a ridiculously stupid thing Napoleon's doing right now. So the idea that plague comes from somewhere else is rooted in the idea of other as dangerous, the dangerous stranger motif that's so common in film and life today. And it allows countries to play out nationalist myths about their superior way of life, their unequaled quality of healthcare, their modernity, for example, right? In the case of COVID, we've heard this repeatedly, this idea of a Chinese disease, right? And eventually, after a particular nation is blamed, the locus of blame becomes turned on the sick themselves, right? Because if they are themselves the form of contagion, then negative meanings attached to the disease become applied to the sufferers. So sufferers come to embody the disease and the meanings that are attached to it. They're stigmatized, they're blamed. Cholera in the 19th century of Europe, for example, was blamed on the poor. Syphilis in the 20th century of North America was viewed as morally sick and a danger to the social order. During the Black Death and the long burn of the second pandemic, known and unknown victims were hastily buried in trenches, for no one could or wanted to claim them with the risk of catching these miasmas. Well, how does that compare to how we've responded in New York from the epidemic of COVID there, where Hart Island has now served as burial grounds for unclaimed victims? This is being used extensively as the epidemic continues to rage throughout New York and New Jersey. And I would argue, or at least I'd like to argue, that that the hazmat suit, here shown on the right, has its origins in the 7th century plague doctor apparel, right? They're still trying to do the same thing, which is keep bad air out. Keep bad air out, aren't they? Isn't that exactly what you see? That's what I see here. Sorry. Importantly, plagues are symptoms and expressions of human relationships. Ask yourself, who gets sick during an epidemic? Who doesn't? Who cares for whom? Who dies and who survives? Why do diseases cluster in some groups and not others? And plagues always speak to global inequities, where some places can better fight them and others can't because of a lack of resources. Think about where the bulk of reporting has come from and ask yourself, why is that, right? So here, I'm thinking about cholera epidemics in Haiti after the famous earthquake on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we have both images from Ecuador and Nigeria dealing with the epidemic of COVID, okay? So during the cholera epidemics of Paris, London, and Philadelphia, it was always the poor who were most affected. Right? These were associated with filthy spaces, associated with the poor who lived there, who had, of course, no access to water and proper health care during that time. And the current evidence suggests a huge bias of COVID-related deaths in African American and African and British population. This is not some underlying genomic background that increases their susceptibility. Let's be really clear. It's an inadequate access to healthcare and basic, simple things that much of us take for granted, such as affordable, nutritious food, water, and of course, access to healthcare. Importantly, plagues reflect our relationship with nature at a very fundamental level in terms of our relationship with other animals. This idea of one health, so here illustrated, is therefore vital. Humans are part of a wider web of interaction that involve animals. So during the Black Death time, land use, which was changing leading up to the Black Death, created unwittingly spaces for rodents to feed and breed, right? And these, of course, rodents which harbor plague then can infect commensal rodents. And most of you will know that during that time, and when we think about plague, most of us think about rat, and rat became the scapegoat du choix for plague, right? And of course, what is that for COVID? Well, now when most people think about COVID, there's this tremendous fear of the bat or the pangolin, right? So what the rat is for plague, the bat and the pangolin are for COVID, and the gorilla was for Ebola, for example. We need to think carefully about that interaction with the natural world in a way that doesn't harm the fragile ecosystem that already sits on a perilous tipping point. So will this pandemic make you think differently about your interaction with nature, the travel you do, your carbon footprint? I certainly hope it does. And despite animals being the origins of most of these sources of infection, we need to remember that it's humans, not animals, that are the most important source of direct connection with each other, right? It's humans that form the most important source of infection. So let's talk more about fear. You know, fear can lead to snakeskin oil salesmen. So medicine had come no further by the beginning of the 19th century as far as infectious diseases were concerned. So here are two remedies in the 19th century cholera epidemic. So on the left, it begins with some sort of bowel complaint from the individual or disturbance of the stomach. And this is, at this stage, relatively easily cured. Here it says go to bed, take hot tea with sage or a balm, take 10 grams of chamomile, and then 1 gram of opium, okay? On the right, the physicians are still trying to balance the humors of the body by having surgeons lance and bleed people. So physicians were really still in the 19th century helpless in the face of disease. So some of the cures that have surfaced for COVID, such as the chloroquine, for example, are fanciful or even worse, right? And so I think it's important, as been recently mentioned in publications on Science Magazine, for example, that confident predictions are grounds for suspicion. Okay, so those are some of the things that we can consider as similarities between past epidemics, but what about the significant differences, right? So during the Black Death, epidemics of cholera, smallpox, people, remember, had no idea what was causing these diseases. Each of these plagues were driven by miasmas, foul odor in air, repeatedly, over and over. So here you can see these illustrations. Up on the left-hand side, cholera and typhus are emerging as this death from ponds in New York City, or cholera is being spread from person to person as some form of contagion back and forth, which we know, of course, it's contaminated water in the case of cholera. And in fact, one of the interesting responses of humans at that time was to burn things. So smoke was believed to protect from miasma. So they would burn fires in the streets. And here's a variation on smudge pots. You would make these heavy smoking pots that would help to sort of purify the air. And it's interesting that it was very fashionable in Paris during these cholera epidemics to smoke. So the women smoked, and the idea by smoking is that you would actually purify the air around you, right? So you change your environment, and therefore you hopefully prevent infectious disease. Well, this is very different. So in the current pandemic, we know the specific cause of this particular epidemic, and that's the SARS coronavirus 2, right? And not only that, we have its complete genome before it even set foot in Europe and North America already in early January. So this is an exceptionally well-characterized virus. This is nothing that anybody in the 19th century and earlier had any idea would be possible, right? And the origins of what we'll call contact tracing might be in 1854 cholera epidemic of London. Of course, here the famous map by Dr. John Snow, tracing and linking death to a pump in Soho, London, right? And of course, ultimately, the, again, illustration of what death here, pumping water filled with cholera to unsuspecting individuals, right? Today, we have geneticists that are tracking the spread of infection using real-time genomic epidemiology. So this is a scale of genomic identity and contact tracing that is unparalleled in anything that we've seen before it, even during the Ebola crisis, right? So this is next strain, Trevor Bedford's next strain. Here, isolation of individual genomes that have been sequenced and careful then mapping across the globe in real time. It's really unprecedented. And in the case of CoV-2, we know that the closest viruses so far come from bats, and the jump could have happened in wet markets. But even that today is difficult to know for sure. And today, in place of prayer, of those that took prayer as the only source of help from the heavens, we have science. The Black Death took 500 years to spread across the globe, right? So these are the current epidemics of plague that we know today still across the globe. SARS-2, or CoV-2, took 24 hours, maybe up to 2 months, depending upon how you do the calculations, which shows the speed at which we can move ourselves and our pathogens across space and through very, very little time, right? And while they're both pandemics, one should be careful when comparing the scale of these pandemics in two very important ways. So in terms of sheer mortality, the Plague of Justinian and the Black Death combined took somewhere in the order of 50 to 100 million people. And importantly, that was somewhere between every third or every other person. That's a level of loss that we can't even begin to comprehend. COVID now has taken nearly 300,000 lives, representing a fraction of the mortality rate of Black Death, somewhere between 0.1 and 1%. But as my wife importantly always reminds me, statistics mean little at the individual level, don't they? An individual loss is a loss nonetheless. So I find it kind of silly to compare pandemics in terms of circles representing total mortality. While it does speak to scale, it doesn't speak to loss. And in my opinion, that's a very important distinction to make. So remember that plagues transform society in a host of ways, large and small. Sam Cohen argued that Black Death changed attitudes towards children in the 15th century, making them much more precious. TB incidents led to changes in fashion, inspired laws prohibiting behaviors such as spitting. And HIV/AIDS gave new meaning to the substances of life, like blood and semen, and changed them into potential sources of death. And so if Black Death made children more precious, perhaps COVID will make elders more appreciated. In 1832, the cholera epidemic killed 20,000 Parisians, and it prompted revolts and riots versus the rich, doctors, and state. And it resulted in opposition and non-compliance. In fact, it's during this time period, of course, it was immortalized in art, again, by Victor Hugo, writing Les Miserables, right? Here's the death of Eponine during the June Rebellion, which was at the end of the cholera epidemic. And what has our response been? Well, meanwhile, in Florida, this response has been completely selfish and irresponsible. But in some ways, looking on past epidemics, it's a somewhat normal response. It's a response to the unknown and the complete exasperation with the situation. Economic consequences, right? During the Black Death, how many people perished that workers had increased power and pay equity. They could demand more pay. Now, in the States, we're facing huge economic toll that we can't possibly comprehend the long-term consequences of this, right? It's important to emphasize that it's really the people that need our care and love right now and respect are the frontline workers. And in that vein, my two heroes right now are our two sons, Max and Tyler, both frontline workers here at a local greengrocer, Tyler, and of course our son, Max, as an ER doc in San Diego. So how will COVID change your behaviors and your beliefs? The question you need to ask right now, because as my colleague Anne Herring famously expanded on, the shape of future plagues will reflect human biosocial relationships. They'll tell moral tales and be read for their social, economic, and political meaning. And so although we may in our short-sightedness and egocentrism, Eurocentrism, think that our experience today is unique or special, in some ways it is, examination of past epidemics provides a broad framework for thinking about and analyzing the perennial problem of plague. Because as Albert Camus reminds us, as the plague recedes in his fictional Algerian town that serves as the backdrop to his novel, we are and never will be free of plagues. We just need to be constantly vigilant. So I want to thank you for listening and being here today. I want to, of course, thank my wife and our lovely children, as well as my fantastic team of graduate students over the time for really providing much of the material that I presented here in this lecture. And with that, I'm just going to say it's time for Q&A. So if you have a question, you can click on the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, and I'll try to get to as many questions as I possibly can. Okay, I'm going to turn it over just to the regular screen. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the questions that come in here on this thing, and I'll reread the question, and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, so you mentioned, so this is from Christine. You mentioned that fear of the unknown is the main response to a pandemic. Do you think conspiracy theories are our modern day response to the unknown, rather than looking for a religious reason as well? The cast with Black Death. I think so. I mean, I think that's one reason. Conspiracy theories are a weird mix of a notion of truth embedded with a sort of a background of falsities that one has to be very careful with. So I think whenever there's a vacuum, fear and conspiracies can raise their head. I mean, so for example, one of the really important things that scientists have done recently, I think, is emphasize that this virus that we know now circulating is not an escape from Wuhan lab. I know this has gotten some traction in the US media as well as the UK media, but it's quite clear from an evolutionary geneticist perspective that this is not the case. This is a simple emergence again of an infectious agent from a zoonotic origin, perhaps exacerbated by the wet markets where there's massive interaction of both people and animals. But I think there's a lot of truth to your question, Christine, that conspiracy theories can raise themselves very quickly in this kind of environment when all the answers just aren't there. And it's important to remind ourselves that we don't know a lot of the answers to these questions. Okay, it's a question from Marie. Hendrik, can your virus genome mapping techniques predict new strains or predict an end of this or other viruses? So that's an interesting question. What we're starting to see now from a lot of research labs that have been studying the Black Death, of course, this doesn't provide an immediate answer now to the pandemic we're living through, shows that there is an attenuation of the virulence over time. So the genome of the late second pandemic strains of Black Death show an attenuation. They're losing virulence, actually, by removing one of those circular plasmids or genomes that I showed you earlier. So I think the Trevor Bedford, Eddie Holmes, Andy Rambeau, Ollie Pybus, all these great evolutionary virologists that are studying the real-time dynamics are looking for changes that might lead to better drug targets, and possibly to changes in transmission. Right now, we don't see any of that. There's nothing that suggests that, but the hope is that by really characterizing this at a genomic level that has never been done before, we may be able to get to answers like that you asked. Okay, Jordan, how did you get into this field of study? He enjoyed the talk. Thank you, Jordan. Wow, that's a good question. Well, there's a couple different things. So the infectious disease, most of that research was being done by my wife when we were both at the Max Planck Institute. My wife was studying the history of infectious diseases, and I was studying extinctions of large megafauna such as the mammoth. And she was like, this is really interesting. Not that mammoths aren't, but infectious diseases are really interesting. Why can't you adapt the techniques you're using for permafrost mammoths to look at ancient diseases? And so we did that. I think to go deeper in time, the interest comes from the fact that my dad is sort of a paleoentomologist and looks at insects trapped in amber. My mom is more along an engineering style, so I wanted some sort of mix between molecular biology and what I thought was the fascinating storytelling of paleontology. So I hope that answers your question, Jordan. Can you explain what the baits and targets mean when trying to sequence the virus? So, okay, so this is an interesting question. Currently, we're actually using the same sort of structure with baits to capture the viruses from infected people in Hamilton and from Sunnybrook in Toronto. And so the question is, can we use the same sort of technology to basically capture? So think of a bait as a fishing rod, but a fishing rod that is very specific to a particular type of fish in a lake. So you have a lake with 100 different fish, but I create a fishing rod now that only pulls up lake perch, okay, or lake trout. And so what the baits do is the baits create a very highly specialized way, a tenterhook of capturing the virus, in this case the virus, out of a complex background of other bacteria and other viruses. And so the question is, can we use that as a very rapid way to detect people that are infected with CoV-2? But then importantly, what other infections are there? One of the big questions now that remains is, are people that have higher mortality rates or higher morbidity co-infected with a host of other respiratory viruses or other pathogens? And so that's something we're using these baits to actually look at a wide variety of infections. Okay, I have a question from Sue. Do you have a few core references for those of us who are interested in exploring this complex set of relationships? I do, and so maybe the best thing to do is actually to follow up with the alumni group here and post some references. So that might be easier to do than to give them to you through this verbally. So I will follow up with that, so check back at that website. Okay, Zoha, your question. In the slide showing a map of Justinian's plague spread, there is an area in the center of infected areas that look uninfected. Is that lack of reporting, or were there actually no cases there? That's a really interesting question. We actually see something similar in the Black Death. There's always this notion that in Poland, there was no Black Death, but we think it's really a case of reporting. So we notice that the best reporting, not surprisingly, comes from urban centers, and the further you get into rural hinterlands, the reporting is quite bad. But we think that's completely an artifact of the reporting. We think it was quite consuming, both Justinian and the Black Death really hit all sorts of ends. I mean, we do know, for example, from Anne Carmichael's great work, that even villages up in the Alps of Europe were actually being hit by plague, but you never find any mortality bills from those areas. So I think that's just an artifact of the way I'm representing what little data is actually known. Oh, okay, and I've got a comment from a friend, Rhonda. Thank you. Thanks for showing up. And thanks for your kind words. Okay, we have Terry. In the aftermath of Spanish flu, we got the roaring 20s, a quick forgetting or return to normal behavior, maybe even with high risk behavior. Are we headed for a similar shift, or will we hunker down and avoid risky behavior? Oh, that's a really interesting question. That's something my wife and I talk about all the time. I think it really depends on the length of how long we're here. So in the case of the Black Death, behavior did change. I mean, things changed. So, people that were sort of on the fence about religion either swept deeply into religion as the only way to protect you, or they were of that mind, why did you take my children? So no more religion for me. The question about how we change our behavior, there's no question that the behavior will change. The question is, are those meaningful behaviors, and do we have a jump start to reset everything? I mean, one of the things that I think is so important now is to consider how the environment is actually improving in the absence of massive numbers of flights and cars on the road and so on and so forth. And how do you balance that with the need for those that are out of work who need to return to work? These are hugely important and significant questions that we don't yet know the answer to, that I'm hoping time will tell. I'm hoping people will consider deeply that we're at a time point, both climatically and economically, that consumerism needs to slow, and our love of nature needs to rise and be protective in the long haul. Dana, you said, was there help by monarchs, nobles, or systems of governance during the Black Death plague, or was it everyone for themselves? Well, it's interesting. So some monarchs were not surprisingly, as we know, some leaders were very helpful. They tried to do the best they could, but again, many of them were at odds with what was actually happening. So we know the king, for example, in 1348 in London, was consumed by the fact that London was dying really in droves. Thousands of people a week were dying with no place to put them, and so he was quite requisitioning farmers' fields to actually put these dead bodies in. So in some cases, you really had deep concern and care and help. In other cases, it was quite clear that they wanted the economy to go on as usual, and so they would do everything to prevent the notion that plague was in their town. So they would hide that information in the hopes that the trucks and not the trucks, but the ships and the carts would still carry the trade. So I think we see both. We see both responses going on. James, do viral-based pandemics run a course and morph into eventually non-contagious virus forms, or do they remain the same with no evolution of the virus? Is a virus a living thing? Oh, well, there's some both interesting biological and philosophical questions there. Whether a virus is a living thing or not, it can't reproduce on its own. It requires a host to do so. So I'll leave that in your guys' hands. Without a host, a virus is really essentially a non-living form. Luckily for the virus, there's lots of living organisms across the globe to infect. But I think, in the case of influenza, we know each year there's a course of influenza, but we know that influenza, now that has erupted on the scene, is a constant occurring, and it's endemic in all nations now, right? And what we know is that basically, if you go to the equator, the influenza strains are constantly emerging and re-emerging, and they remain in the equator, and then they move up into the north or the southern hemisphere, depending on the time and the climate and the weather. So it's a constant. It's going to be a constant battle. This is now, the coronavirus is likely to be something that we live with forever, and that we probably have a yearly vaccine for ultimately, like we do with flu. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. So Ron, if we are behaving similarly culturally during this pandemic as in previous pandemic, why wasn't mankind prepared better? Humans usually learn from their mistakes. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, so I think in some ways we have. So quarantine, was enacted on a tremendous scale in China, bigger than anything we certainly have had in past. Unfortunately, it was done at the cost of being too late. And there you have to remember that despite the fact that we have more information now, the fear again is blame, right? And so on one hand, you could say, well, the Chinese were really slow at getting this information out and they suppressed the information. On the other hand, what happened? The Chinese got blamed for the pandemic, right? Once again. So in some ways, it makes total sense that you would sit there and not want to admit that you have an epidemic, because you're going to get stigmatized, you're going to get blamed. Who knows what the economic fallouts or something like that would be. On the other hand, you need to rise to the occasion and go, there's a greater good here that we need to consider. And so we're going to have to let that information fly, despite the fact that there's going to be blame and stigmatization, right? So, we're also at a genomic epidemiological level, far better prepared. I think the sad part is that the United States and had plenty of time to prepare, given what they did know eventually, and too little came too late. Okay, Richard, Hendrik, what are the chances my wife and I, mid-60s, will be able to return to our Mexican condo in January with any genuine sense that we're not taking a mortal risk with our lives? Well, that depends really on a vaccine or a good antibody test, which I think is still far away, unfortunately. So my suggestion is to watch and wait and make sure that the reporting is good, which is always difficult to know for sure. But I would say that I'm not quite sure I'll be going with you to Mexico, Richard. Not in January yet. Okay, I think that's all the time. I'm being given the red light here as to all the time that I have today to answer your fantastic questions. Maybe if you continue to ask them, maybe those leading the lecture can post them, and I'll try to do my best to answer them online. Anyways, I want to thank you guys again for tuning in and listening to my lecture. I hope I provided a tiny bit of useful information to you all. Stay healthy and take care. Okay, bye-bye.
Learning never ends at McMaster. Welcome to an opportunity to engage your curiosity from the comfort of your own environment. This online series is sponsored by the McMaster Alumni Association as part of our goal to connect with our global alumni and their curious minds.